Hello and welcome to section 5.2, video number 2 of 2 parts. This will be the last part of section 5.2. First thing we're going to look at is the Pythagorean identities. And again, this is continuation of section 5.2. The first Pythagorean identity that we're going to look at, and you'll see I'm switching markers here, I'm writing this in red. The reason being, throughout the semester, this will probably be the most important identity that we use. If you're ever working a problem and you get stuck, my recommendation to you would be, think back to this identity. Is there any way that you can utilize this identity I'm going to show you right now? And it says the following, that sine squared of t plus cosine squared of t is equal to 1. Now we have some new notation here, this cosine squared of t. Well, what this really means is just the cosine value of t, and we square it. Obviously this is a lot cleaner looking than that one, so we just write cosine squared t, which means that whatever value for t we have, we take the cosine and then square it. That's identity number 1. Number 2 is that tangent squared of t plus 1 is equal to the secant squared value of t. And third, 1 plus cotangent squared of t is equal to cosecant squared of t. So here you are again, you're probably thinking, great, more memorization, how am I ever going to remember all of this stuff? Well, again, the main thing is identity number 1. Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. If you can remember this one, which by the end of the semester I'm sure it'll just be second nature, you won't have to necessarily memorize it. But if you remember this, you can get to these other ones based off of your knowledge of the trig functions. For example, if I wanted to get from the first one to the second one, well, to get to tangent, let's say I'm given a problem that we're using tangent and we don't have sine or cosine. Well, we can get to this one because we know that tangent is just sine over cosine. So if from this top one, if I have sine squared of t, if I divide it by cosine squared of t, well, this thing is really just what? This is tangent squared of t. But because I divided this one by cosine squared of t, I have to do the rest. So if I do cosine squared of t divided by cosine squared of t, well, this is just 1. And 1 over cosine squared of t is just secant squared of t. And this is from our relations that we just dealt with in section 5.2, video 1. So you can see, as long as you remember this first one, you're able to derive these other ones, need that be the case. All right, so let's look at an example how we can utilize this information. If you haven't gotten it down, go ahead, pause, start it back up as soon as you're ready to go. All right, let's say we have the following example. If we are given that cosine of t is equal to 3/5 and t is in quadrant 4. I'm going to pause there for a second. Why? Throughout the semester, we are going to get a lot of different problems that tell us what quadrant we are dealing with. If you have those problems, as soon as you see that information, I would put a box around that information. Because if the problem is telling us what quadrant we are working in, there has to be a reason. And it is, because it will affect the sign of our cosine values, our sine values, the tangent values, if they're positive, negative, and so forth. So we have to pay attention to that. So we're told to begin with cosine t is 3/5 and is quadrant 4. We want to find the values of the trig functions at this point t, our terminal point. All right, so we're given cosine, but we need to find the rest of them: sine, tangent, cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So we're going to use our trig identities. Excuse me. First one we have is sine squared of t plus cosine squared of t is 1. Again, our holy grail of the identities. So remember, this guy is really just the cosine of t, and we want to square whatever value that is. So we're given in the problem that cosine of t is 3/5. So that means sine squared of t plus 3/5 squared, which is our value of cosine of t, is equal to 1. So therefore, sine squared of t plus, if we square numerator and denominator, we get 9/25 is equal to 1. This is where your fraction math is going to come in. Hopefully you're strong in fractions. If not, make sure you work on that so you don't lose points off of the fraction math. Here we're going to want to subtract 9/25 from both sides. And 1 is like 25/25. So this means we get sine squared of t, 25/5 minus 9/25 is 16/25. So this gives us a value of sine squared, but we want just sine, which means we need to take the square root of both sides. And if we do that, we get sine of t is plus or minus the square root of 16/25. So using a quotient rule from our radical expressions, this is the same as plus or minus square root of 16 is 4, square root of 25 is 5. So that means that sine of t is plus or minus 4/5. This is where we have to go back to what quadrant we're in. When we're in quadrant 4, so we're down here, our value of cosine is what? That's like our x values, that's positive, but the sine values are negative, which means that our value for sine of t is going to be negative 4/5. And again, that's because we're in quadrant 4. Okay, so now that we have sine of t and cosine of t, we can then figure out the other trig values that we need. The first one, if we look at tangent. So tangent of t is sine of t over cosine of t. So that's minus 4/5 over positive 3/5. So this is minus 4/5 times 5/3. If we keep change flip, 5's cancel, so we get that tangent of t is minus 4/3. We can now use our reciprocal property. So if we have sine of t is minus 4/5, then we know that cosecant of t is if we just flip that value. So minus 5/4. Secant of t is just 1 over cosine. So if cosine is 3/5, secant would be 5/3. Again, the reciprocal properties, we just switch the numerators and denominators. Don't switch signs. If it has a negative, leave it as a negative. If it has a positive, leave it as a positive. And then lastly, cotangent of t is just minus, because we have minus in the tangent, and then becomes 3/4. So our 6 values for the trig functions: cosine of t is 3/5, sine of t is minus 4/5, tangent of t is minus 4/3, cosecant is minus 5/4, secant is 5/3, and cotangent is negative 3/4. that is the video with regards to the trig identities and how we would use that, the Pythagorean identities. The one last little note I'll give you in terms of 5.2 is if you start using a calculator for the homework problems here. Your calculator is probably set in degree mode. So when you're looking at your screen, probably up at the top, you're either going to have a D or a DEG, something like that to let it know what mode you're in. You need to change that now so that it has an R or a rad. You want to make sure that you're working in rad mode or radian mode when you're trying to figure out these homework problems. So again, if one of the homework problems calls for a calculator use, make sure you're in radian mode. If you're not sure how to change it over, when you come to class, ask me before class, and I'll help you take care of that. So that wraps up the video for 5.2. Both the videos for that section. We'll see you in 5.3.